Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the podcast. Joining us this week, the marvelous Miss Lushenko.
Hey guys.
Myself, Mr. Ramey, and the man, the myth, the legend, Mr. Jonas Fredrickson.
How's it going, everybody?
So kids, what you don't know is that poor Mr. Fredrickson not only had me as a student, but he also had Mr. Ramey. And rumor has it you have to hang out with Skylar on a daily basis. Is that true?
Well, somebody has to, so.
Well, she's pretty awesome. You're pretty lucky to have great kids.
Yeah, I do. I'm pretty lucky. And I will say that Ms. Lushenko and Mr. Ramey were fantastic students. I'm not just making that up. They were wonderful, and I enjoyed having them in class. It was a long time ago, but it's crazy.
Kids, you missed that. It was a long time ago. He probably has like Alzheimer's now or something.
He's forgotten the entire experience.
I do know that I was kind of naughty in your class. I
don't remember that.
Quint and Ben Alexander and yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, now you're reminding me.
U.S. history. It was a pretty naughty class.
Yeah.
But it was fun.
It definitely was.
You know, the one thing that you've taught
What's that?
You always taught me that Polk had a mullet. That, you know, out of everything in U.S. history, that's what I remember.
That's right, and it's making a comeback in Battleground now, I noticed. So Polk is a hip dude now.
Yeah. All right, Mr. Ramey, what do we have for us today?
All right. Well, first off, we need to have a shout out to the students that are working hard and diligent from our various classes. Ms. Lushenko, who is doing the work for you?
You know, that is a great question. I definitely see some work from Audrey, and I am seeing some work from Skylar. And I'm sure there's some other people, and I'll get to you in just a minute with that information.
Just momentarily.
Yes, momentarily. I've been at the vet all day, so I'm kind of falling behind.
It happens.
It does. What about you? Oh, Sophia K and Dorina and Haley L and Megan Smith. Doing some awesome work. Yeah, nothing like checking your assignment the last minute.
Uh-huh.
And so who else is doing some good work? Oh, we got Susie and Noah Curry and Robert. Great job, guys. Oh, and Gunner. Wow, way to go, Gunner. And Gabe.
Nice job, you guys.
And there are some more. I just, again, haven't got to reading all of them yet. So good job. Keep it up. Mr. Ramey, what about in your guys' class or in Mrs. Coleman's class?
Ms. Coleman wanted to make sure she give a shout out to Danny, Marshall, Kevin, Jonathan, Connor, Talina, Joseph, and Abby. Excellent work.
Good job, guys.
I received some great work from Darlene and from Artem T. Well done.
Missed you guys. All right, so Mr. Fred, last week we were talking about the causes of the Civil War, and we got all the way up to the states now succeeding. So one of the main questions the kids get is, did most people in the South own slaves? That's kind of a question that we get often.
You know, to be completely honest, when I was a kid and I learned about the Civil War, the assumption always was that, you know, the vast majority of people in the South owned slaves. That's why they had such a vested interest in the success of the Confederacy and, you know, was holding on to their way of life. But, you know, it wasn't until I really got into college that I realized that was, you know, really inaccurate. Only about 75% of the South did not own a single slave. Only about 25% did. And of that 25% that owned slaves, generally the majority of them only owned maybe 2 or 3 slaves. This idea that, you know, there were these sprawling plantations in the South with these, you know, vast domains of cotton land and hundreds of slaves, maybe that might have been maybe about 1,000 families throughout the entire South. But like I said, over 75% of the people in the South, the white South, did not own a single slave. And it's always kind of puzzled historians why they were such fierce defenders of the Confederacy, especially if they're fighting for something that they didn't really benefit from. They pondered that for years and years and years. And I think the mindset had always been that, for many of those poor whites in the South, the idea that, the potential down the road, maybe owning a slave and alleviating some of their toil, their work, kept them fighting on. But it was this idea that a lot of these guys that were in the Confederate Army were fighting for something that wasn't benefiting them really.
Yeah, I didn't learn about that, obviously. Well, probably tell your class, but it shocks me every time to think about it, how not very many people actually own slaves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's one of those big, quandaries of studying the Civil War is, how disproportionate it was. And there were a lot of books that came out prior to the Civil War, and they were written by Southerners, white Southerners, about how poor white people in the South were kind of victimized by the slave situation, how wages were down and depressed in the South because, slave labor competition was more than they could handle. And, but that's always something that's kind of hit me. And it always surprises my kids, believe it or not, every year when I teach about it, that, only about 25% owned slaves and most of them only owned a few. So yeah, it is kind of puzzling.
Thank you. Mr. Ramey, did you have something you wanted to add or move on to?
Yes.
I guess good.
I'm formulating a question.
Oh, okay. You keep thinking now.
The question is, I guess since only 25% of these people owned slaves, how did the Confederacy raise an army of people willing to fight over this issue? Was it just phrased to them in a different way? They were fighting for something else? Or what was the recruitment pitch, I guess?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's, one of the coolest things about history, and I know you guys know this as well, and I think your students are going to learn about it as well, is the multiple interpretations of, those kinds of things, those historical questions that do come about. I mean, we're talking about an army that fought dang near to the death. I mean, if you look at the conditions of Robert E. Lee's forces when they surrendered after the Civil War was over, they didn't have socks, they didn't have shoes, they hadn't had food in days, and they were not interested in surrendering. So, I mean, how could these have such a determined, such a will to fight for, something that wasn't necessarily really benefiting them? The way they sold it, I think, for the most part, to the poor white Confederates, were, we're fighting for our way of life. There was a very intentional focus by the Confederate leadership to shape this into something very similar to the American Revolution. This idea of, we have grown apart. We're a very different people. We have very different standards, a different civilization. And it's in our best interest to segment ourselves away from this section of the country that doesn't identify in a lot of the same ways that we do, doesn't believe in a lot of the same things that we do. And so, for these poor Confederate soldiers that were fighting, they were fighting for a way of life that they believed that their rights were being trampled upon. They believed that, the idea of a local government, a very small local government that had a greater control over, a smaller area, was worth fighting for. As the North, developed, the North was becoming heavy with immigration. It was becoming very industrialized. It was going in a different direction than the South was. The South believed that their civilization was very similar to the age of chivalry in British history. When you had the knights in shining armor and you had these feudal landlords and so on and so forth. And they just believed that, they were fighting for a civilization that was above and beyond anything else that had been created. And like I said earlier, there was this idea among a lot of poor white Southerners that, they may not be able to afford their own piece of land now, but they will. And when they afford that piece of land, they wanted to have the opportunity to have a slave or a slave or two, or maybe a slave family that could take off some of the pressure of work that, that a farm might entail. So it was this idea of fighting for something that didn't necessarily affect them at the time, but it could have benefited them in the future. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I want to go back to one thing that you said. You said the South was kind of using the same idea as during the Revolutionary War. And so this week's assignment, we have our kids looking at the Declaration of Independence and looking at also the Constitution. And they're taking different parts of these two historical documents written, right around the Revolutionary time, before and after, and they're using that to determine if these states actually had a reason to break away. Like, was it okay? Was it, legal for the states to break away? What are your thoughts?
It's such an interesting point of view, because there were two really strong camps with regards to secession, whether secession was legal or not. And this dates back to the very creation. Well, I mean, boy, this is a tough one to not go into too much detail on, to be honest.
Yeah,
but,
it is.
I mean, we had a first form of government before we had this Constitution. And that first form of government, it was called the Articles of Confederation.
And the kids should be aware of that.
Yeah, good. Well, I mean, that put all the power in the hands of the states. And so the states had significant power. And what kids need to understand is that when we created this new Constitution with this new federal president and a Congress and a court system, it took a lot of power away from the states, a huge amount of power. And it put all the states under this big, federal umbrella, right? This federal government. Now, there is a segment in the Constitution that does say that federal laws are supreme, that states cannot overturn federal laws. They have to abide by those. But man, within a decade after the Constitution was created, there were already questions about what powers states had in this new type of system, this new type of government system. Again, I don't want to bore you with too many details, but just after the Constitution was created, actually less than 10 years after the Constitution was created, there was a law passed called the Sedition Act. And the Sedition Act was this law that made it illegal for people to criticize their government, to criticize leaders in the government, and so on.
Now, how can that be
a lot
illegal?
of people felt it was definitely a slap in the face of the First Amendment. I mean, the First Amendment says you can criticize your government, the president, Congress, you can do that. And people do, as you've seen on social media, I'm sure. It's one of the rights people have in this country. But it wasn't who determines whether that's legal or not? Who determines whether that's constitutional? You had one group that said, well, it was the U.S. Supreme Court that said would determine if that's constitutional. So a lot of people were hoping the Supreme Court would strike down that Sedition Act, but it didn't. And so the states actually, Virginia and Kentucky in this situation, actually invalidated that law. They actually said this law is not going to be abided by anybody within our states. And so the question really came about is, well, who determines whether the federal government has made a law that is flying in the face of the Constitution? One side says it's the Supreme Court, the other side said it's up to the states. And that's not the only time. 1797 wasn't the only time that came about. It did come about once again in the 1830s. South Carolina did not want to pay federal taxes. They felt like the taxes were really unfair to them. So they invalidated federal taxes within their state. There was another time during the War of 1812 where a bunch of states in the New England area, Massachusetts, Connecticut, were actually considering the idea of seceding from the Union. Because they were upset about the War of 1812. They didn't want to go into the War of 1812. They wanted to have a great relationship with the British. So they were considering the idea of secession. So the idea of secession and removing yourself from the Union to Southerners was logical, because when it came down to it, the Constitution was created by these 55 delegates, right, in the Constitutional Convention. And then it was given out to the states. But the states had to approve this Constitution. The states had to give it the thumbs up and had to be willing to join this new federal government, right? And so their mindset was, we have to, but they had to basically come up with a determination of, who is going to determine constitutionality. So there was that mindset, though. They actually called it a compact theory, that it was the states that brought the Constitution into being. It was the states that created this federal government that we have, and the states were members of those. And so there were a lot of people that did philosophically believe that since the states had a role in bringing this federal government into existence, that they could not only just question laws of the federal government and choose at times to invalidate laws by the federal government within their states, but there was this mindset that if things got so bad in that federal government, in this union, that they really did have the legitimacy, the right and the power to remove themselves from the union. This idea of secession and declaring federal laws null and void within your state, this is something that had been absolutely, dividing America. Shortly after the Constitution, within 10 years of the Constitution being created, there are already people that were questioning federal laws, questioning, if a state disagrees with a federal law, are they obligated to follow it? And there were times that it came to, there was almost a situation in the 1830s where President Andrew Jackson had to pull federal troops together and invade South Carolina to force South Carolina to pay federal taxes, federal impost duties.
And the Civil War wasn't even until 1860. So this is 30 years before South Carolina actually seceded.
Yeah. And if you look at, like I said, it wasn't a widespread view, but there were many people in New England during the War of 1812. There's at a place called the Hartford Convention where they were actually considering seceding from the United States. So the idea of how much power does the federal government have over the states, this idea of, are we stuck in this? It's like in their mind, in the Southerners' mind, we joined this club so that this club would benefit us. And if we feel like our membership in this club isn't benefiting us, then we have the right to, remove our membership from this club. And it wasn't until after the Civil War where that idea of secession and what rights states have, really comes into question. And, what's interesting is, and you guys probably, caught it too, it's, currently with the coronavirus and COVID, this idea of states and the power of the state's government versus the power of the federal government just came into question because, President Trump wasn't sure that he could issue a directive to every single state to make a stay-at-home order stick. He wanted to leave governors to make that decision. So here's the federal government kind of, saying we're going to leave it up to the states. But at the same time, a couple of weeks ago, he was considering reopening the economies. And a lot of states were saying, we're not prepared to reopen our economy. And he also realized that the government doesn't have that much power to do so. So this relationship between states and the power that they have versus the federal government and the power that they have over the states, it's not the session, obviously, 150 years ago, but it's still something that really perplexes historians and political scientists is, what relationship the government have between each other, the state and the federal government.
It's like
that was a really long way to answer that question, I think.
No, I think that's good. I always picture the state and the federal government, they're like dancing partners. They have to get along.
Yeah.
At sometimes they just really don't. Issues, and that's when things start to fumble and fall apart. I'm sure there's a better analogy out there, but.
Well, if you look at the 1950s and segregation, the Supreme Court ruled in 1904 that you can segregate, white kids and African American kids. You couldn't segregate them anymore. It was deemed illegal, right? It was unconstitutional. But segregation was still alive and well into the mid-1960s in the South because they just refused to abide by the Supreme Court decision. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of layers to this relationship between the federal and state governments, but the Southerners just the Confederates just did not feel like they were breaking the law. I mean, to go back to an earlier point, they felt like they were doing what we were doing against the British. Like Americans felt like they were somebody different. They weren't British people living in America anymore. They were Americans, and they wanted to have more control over their own lives. So when the Confederates did the same thing, they weren't lost on that connection, and they made a lot of attempts to make people see the similarities between the American Revolution and, I guess you could say, the Confederate secession.
Now, we all know that the North won, and that eventually, the South does lose, but it was a long and bloody war. So can you talk us through like the different strategies? Why was it so long? Why was it so bloody? Why didn't the North just win right out of the bat? Or can you walk us through some of those points?
Well, this again is one of those, I mean, it's why I got into history. It really is. It's why did the Union win? And your other question is how did in a million years, as long as it did, it's one of those cool things to debate back and forth. I mean, 2020, and we're still debating why exactly did that take place. The best way to answer that is there were multiple reasons. If you look at the advantages and disadvantages, I mean, it wasn't even close. I mean, it's like it's like looking at high school basketball team going against the Blazers or something like that. It just seemed like it was totally one-sided, and just seemed like all the advantages were in the North.
Now,
I mean, the
who
North
would
had
be the Blazers, and who would be like our battleground high school boys?
Okay, I would think the Confederates would be the high school basketball team.
Okay, so the South would be like.
Yeah, and the North seemed like they were the Blazers. I mean, if you think about it, it's like they had, 85% of all the factories. They had most of the railroad tracks. They had a huge numerical superiority. There were like 22 million people that lived in the North, and there were only 9 that lived in the South. And of that 9 million, 4 million of them were slaves. I mean, you're somebody who studies military tactics and conflicts, and it just doesn't seem like the South could ever last. But a lot of historians consistently debated is how did the South last as long as they did? And a lot of people say that the early strategies that the Union used were too careful. They were too they weren't aggressive enough. And that's one of the reasons that Abraham Lincoln really was frustrated throughout the first few years of the war, because I don't know if you ever look at it, but he would put this guy in charge of the army, and then he would fail, and then he would replace him. I mean, he went through one general after another trying to find somebody who was actually really super aggressive against the Confederacy. There was a guy named McClellan, and McClellan was considered to be the little Napoleon. He graduated at the top of his class of West Point. He was a brilliant strategist and brilliant tactician, but he was really slow and careful and methodical and never wanted to take a chance. And so he would have, it seemed like at times, especially at a place called Antietam, he had an opportunity to corner the Confederate Army, the Army of Northern Virginia, and destroy it. That was Lee's army. And he didn't pursue him. And so for Lincoln, it was like, I got to find somebody that's aggressive. I got to find somebody that's going to go after the enemy with a lot of vigor. And he went, like I said, through one general after another until he finally came to Grant. And Grant wasn't perfect, not by any means. Grant had a reputation of, somebody that would just throw men into battle and just get absolutely massacred. But he would take that position. He would. So if he wanted to take a hill and it was well defended by the Confederates, he would just simply send so many men at the Confederate forces that they just simply couldn't kill them all. And he would take that hill. Now, there were enormous casualties on both sides, but he was having success. So he put the entire Union Army in Grant's hands. And Grant was, some might call him reckless. What's funny about Grant is he actually did serve in Fort Vancouver. He was actually at Vancouver serving the army at one point, and some people think he developed alcoholism there because of the rain and the weather.
Because of the depression and the
depression was hitting him. A lot of the guys weren't ready for the weather when they came out here, but and they think on the eve of one of his greatest battlefield victories, Battle of Shiloh, that he was drunk. So he was reckless, and he was really controversial, but he was aggressive, and that's why Lincoln went with him. After that, it wasn't like one great victory after another, but it was moving in the right direction. But the other part of that is a lot of people think that Confederate soldiers were better in a lot of ways. They may have been more committed. Now, commitment obviously isn't going to give you, ammunition when you're running out of it. It's not going to give you food when you're running out of food. But a commitment will make you do things that maybe other soldiers aren't willing to do. Cross rivers, stay up all night, traveling, whatever it takes. And the Confederate soldiers were also more rural. They were more, agrarian. They were country boys. So a lot of times they knew about horses. They knew how to hunt. They knew how to, work guns. Whereas Union forces, some of them were immigrants who didn't even speak English. And also a lot of the Union forces were city boys. They weren't accustomed to doing a lot of things. And so, and then the leadership, you can't underestimate the leadership. One thing about the South is they have, Virginia Military Institute, the Citadel, all these other, in addition to West Point, they have a lot of military schools and a strong military tradition. And if you look at like some of the leadership, they had like Robert E. Lee, Johnston,
Stonewall Jackson.
Stonewall Jackson, you can't, oh my gosh, absolutely. I mean, they had tremendous leadership, and they won battles because mostly, Lee would do things that would just absolutely twist up the Union forces. He would split his forces at a time that nobody in a million years ever thought he should do it or would do it. I mean, he would always win the day, and it was seemingly always with less materials and less soldiers. So leadership, the quality of soldiers, Northern strategies being maybe just a little bit too hesitant and a little bit too careful might have cost them a lot of battlefield victories. And there's other factors there, but those are some of the few that I've heard.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I think those are definitely the ones that we would touch on if we were actually in school. That is exactly what we would touch on if we were in school. But now that we have to do everything virtual, it's very different. I don't know if you're feeling that well at the high school level.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, for sure.
So, Ramey, do you think that's about it, or do we have time for one more question?
No further questions, Your Honor.
No, that's right. You better address me as such. Oh, we'll see. Maybe that's what I do in my next career, be a judge, an attorney.
That'd be good.
Yeah.
Good thinking.
Well, Mr. Fred, do you have any questions or anything else you want to make sure to add in?
No, I hopefully I wasn't too boring. I mean, sometimes you have to turn me off. You have to flip a switch and get me to like stop talking about history. But
that's when I muted you,
That's fair enough.
No, thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah. No, I look forward. Everybody I've talked to absolutely loves your guys' classes. My daughter loves the classes, and I'm looking forward to having all your kids next year. Hopefully, they're all coming to Battleground. And
actually, no. Do you?
Oh, really?
Yeah, about a third of our kids are going to Prairie now that the boundaries changed.
Oh, is that right?
It's crazy, isn't it? Yeah, but we told them they should have you.
Absolutely.
Obviously, anything Mr. Ramey and I forgot to teach them, which is a lot, you can.
Sounds good
on those gaps.
Yeah. So when they say our teacher didn't teach us, please believe them. They always say don't believe them, but
Oh, come on.
We try to teach them how to be nice.
That's the challenge. I'm sure you guys have done a wonderful job.
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming on. 8th graders, remember, do send us an email, send us a remind, do your work. Feel free to send us something if you want us to give a shout out to. Anything else, Mr. Ramey, Mr. Fred, before we end the recording?
I don't think so. Look forward to seeing you guys next year.